Hello, welcome to the lecture on cognition, or thinking, and intelligence. So let's go ahead and dive right in. So there actually isn't a lot that psychologists know about cognitions and about what happens in the mind when we think. Partly because a little bit of that process is intangible, it's metaphysical, it can't really be examined under the microscope, what goes on with your thoughts. But what we do know is that thinking involves the manipulation of mental representations of images, and we call those images mental images. So mental images are representations in the mind that resemble the object or event being represented. And representations may take the form of words, images, sounds, or data stored in memory. So seeing a best friend, hearing a song, or any sense that we can produce in our mind's eye, even the smell of bacon could be a mental image. So one thing that is unique to human beings that we're not convinced in psychology that all animals have the ability to do is that we as humans are able to rotate and manipulate the mental images in our mind. So if you're looking at the screen, you see this Rubik's Cube. And now if you were to close your eyes, you could spin this Rubik's Cube in a circle in your mind. You could move the pieces around and mix up the colors. You could throw the Rubik's Cube up in the air and hear it fall to the floor, all by producing mental images in your mind's eye. We also create mental images in our minds and then recreate them in real life. So if I were to hand you a lump of Play-Doh and ask you to shape it into a castle or a snake, you would be able to do so because you can first visualize what that would look like in your mind and then recreate it in real life. So these mental images not only represent something that we've seen or heard or smelled, but it's also part of our imagination. We can create these mental images and then represent them physically through drawings or artwork or Play-Doh or whatever. So if we were to define thinking, we would say that thinking is a mental activity that goes on in the brain when a person is organizing and attempting to understand information and communicate that information to other people. So thinking allows us to answer questions, thinking allows us to solve problems, or to reach goals. So one of the main functions of thinking is categorizing. And we're constantly categorizing the world in which we live to help us gain a better understanding, make sense of things we've never seen before, and as a way to simplify complicated concepts. So speaking of concepts, concepts is actually a term that we use in cognitive psychology. And the definition of concepts is an idea that represents a class or category of objects, events, or activities. So if I was to ask you what's in your kitchen cabinet, you could say to me 1 jar of peanut butter, 6 boxes of mac and cheese, some Ritz crackers, or you could just say food. And if you said food, food would be what we call the concept, the representation of the category of all of those items that you had just listed. So in a concept, there are superordinate concepts, which is going to be the most general form of a type of concept, so like furniture, for example. And then there is the basic level type concept, which is an example of a type of concept around which other similar concepts are organized, such as chair. And then there is subordinate concepts, and these are the most specific category of a concept. So this would be like armchair or Windsor chair. A formal concept is a concept that is defined by a strict set of rules or features. For example, a square. A square must have 4 equal sides, and those are the rules, so this would be a formal concept. And finally, there are natural concepts. And these are concepts people form as a result of their experiences in the real world. So if I were to ask you what is a vehicle, you might say that it's a truck, if that's the type of vehicle that you have, or the type of vehicle that you've been around a lot. But maybe if you live in Alaska, you would say dog sledding is a vehicle, because that's been your experience. So we tend to use natural concepts when the rules are not strict and features can vary. Then we rely on our experience. And this can help us to classify new objects, maybe that we've never seen before, but we can use our natural concepts or our past experience to help us make sense of these new things we've never seen before. For example, if you see someone tapping a handheld screen, maybe you've never seen that exact model of technology before, but you're able to deduce that it's a phone based on the size and shape of it and your experience with objects that are similar to that object and with the way you behave with an object similar to that in your own life. So this is how we use natural concepts. We also use something called prototypes to help us define concepts that are broad or ambiguous. So a prototype is a typical, highly representative example of a concept. If I were to ask you to look at the screen and then put these objects into a concept, what do you think that concept would be called? Tables. Right. If I were to ask you to choose the one that's the most representative of the concept, so here your options are poker table, drafting table, pool table, or coffee table, although that's kind of a funky looking coffee table. Most of us would probably decide that the coffee table is the one that's the most representative. Or when you think of table just on your own, generally you probably think of a coffee table over these other options. So coffee table then would be our prototype. So ultimately the way we come up with a prototype and what constitutes a prototype varies from person to person. The prototypes that we use depend on our own experience, culture, attitudes, and knowledge. For example, I'm a psychologist. I spend a lot of time talking and thinking about psychology and researching it. So I often see the world through the lens of psychology. And one time I was at Olive Garden with my mom, and there was a man sitting next to us that was talking to himself. And so when I see a person talking to themselves, my brain puts that person into the category of someone with mental illness, probably schizophrenia. So I had determined that he was schizophrenic based on my prototype of people that talk to themselves. That would be schizophrenia, and that would be in the concept of mental illness. And so at the end of our lunch, we walked past him, and I noticed that he, in fact, had a Bluetooth on. So our prototypes can cause us to err in understanding the world, but they also can cause us to be correct, depending on the situation. We use concepts in thinking and in problem solving. So problem solving is the process of cognition that occurs when a goal must be reached by thinking and behaving in certain ways. Generally, when problem solving, we try to use shortcuts called algorithms and heuristics. So an algorithm is a very specific step-by-step procedure for solving certain types of problems. Algorithms guarantee a solution. Examples of algorithms include math formulas, geometry principles. So let's go ahead and watch a quick video on algorithms.
What's an algorithm? In computer science, an algorithm is a set of instructions for solving some problem, step by step. Typically, algorithms are executed by computers, but we humans have algorithms as well. For instance, how would you go about counting the number of people in a room? Well, if you're like me, you'd probably point at each person, one at a time, and count up from 0. 1, 2, 3, 4, and so forth. Well, that's an algorithm. In fact, let's try to express it a bit more formally in pseudocode, English-like syntax that resembles a programming language. Let n equal 0. For each person in room, set n equal to n plus 1. How to interpret this pseudocode? Well, line 1 declares, so to speak, a variable called n and initializes its value to 0. This just means that at the beginning of our algorithm, the thing with which we're counting has a value of 0. After all, before we start counting, we haven't counted anything yet. Calling this variable n is just a convention. I could have called it most anything. Now, line 2 demarks the start of a loop, a sequence of steps that will repeat some number of times. So in our example, the step we're taking is counting people in the room. Beneath line 2 is line 3, which describes exactly how we'll go about counting. The indentation implies that it's line 3 that will repeat. So what the pseudocode is saying is that after starting at 0, for each person in the room, we'll increase n by 1. Now, is this algorithm correct? Well, let's bang on it a bit. Does it work if there are 2 people in the room? Let's see. In line 1, we initialize n to 0. For each of these 2 people, we then increment n by 1. So on the first trip through the loop, we update n from 0 to 1. On the second trip through that same loop, we update n from 1 to 2. And so, by this algorithm's end, n is 2, which indeed matches the number of people in the room. So far, so good. How about a corner case, though? Suppose that there are 0 people in the room, besides me, who's doing the counting. In line 1, we again initialize n to 0. This time, though, line 3 doesn't execute at all, since there isn't a person in the room, and so n remains 0, which indeed matches the number of people in the room. Pretty simple, right? But counting people one at a time is pretty inefficient too, no? Surely we can do better. Why not count 2 people at a time? Instead of counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and so forth, why not count 2, 4, 6, 8, and so on? It even sounds faster, and it surely is. Let's express this optimization in pseudocode. Let n equal 0. For each pair of people in room, set n equal to n plus 2. Pretty simple change, right? Rather than count people one at a time, we instead count them 2 at a time. This algorithm does twice as fast as the last. But is it correct? Let's see. Does it work if there are 2 people in the room? In line 1, we initialize n to 0. For that one pair of people, we then increment n by 2, and so by this algorithm's end, n is 2, which indeed matches the number of people in the room. Suppose next that there are 0 people in the room. In line 1, we initialize n to 0. As before, line 3 doesn't execute at all, since there aren't any pairs of people in the room, and so n remains 0, which indeed matches the number of people in the room. But what if there are 3 people in the room? How does this algorithm fare? Let's see. In line 1, we initialize n to 0. For a pair of those people, we then increment n by 2, but then what? There isn't another full pair of people in the room, so line 2 no longer applies. And so by this algorithm's end, n is still 2, which isn't correct. Indeed, this algorithm is said to be buggy because it has a mistake. Let's redress with some new pseudocode. Let n equal 0. For each pair of people in room, set n equal to n plus 2. If one person remains unpaired, set n equal to n plus 1. To solve this particular problem, we've introduced in line 4 a condition, otherwise known as a branch, that only executes if there's one person we could not pair with another. And so now, whether there's 1 or 3 or any odd number of people in the room, this algorithm will now count them. Can we do even better? Well, we could count in 3s or 4s or even 5s and 10s, but beyond that it's going to get a little bit difficult to point. At the end of the day, whether executed by computers or humans, algorithms are just a set of instructions with which to solve problems. These were just 3. What problem would you solve with an algorithm?
We also use heuristics to help us problem solve. And a heuristic is an educated guess based on prior experiences that helps us narrow down the possible solutions for a problem. It's like a rule of thumb. So it's a cognitive shortcut that may lead to a solution, but does not always lead to a solution. So there are 2 types of heuristics: representative heuristics and availability heuristics. A representative heuristic assumes that any object or person that shares characteristics with the members of a particular category are of that category. So for example, a tomato is savory, porous, and grows in the ground, so it must be a vegetable. But in fact, we know that a tomato is not a vegetable. It is a fruit. So this can cause us to err when we judge people as well. For example, if we were to judge a person with dark skin as being from Africa, not all people with dark skin are from Africa, obviously, and not all Africans have dark skin. There are also availability heuristics, and availability heuristics are when we think that events that are easier to remember are more likely to occur again versus events that are harder to remember. So for example, people are generally more scared of airplanes than car crashes because airplanes get way more publicity than a car crash does. So an airplane crash tends to be on the forefront of your mind and available to access that information in a much easier way than a car crash is, and in a much more profound way. So now we are going to take a more in-depth look at how we go about solving problems. To start our discussion, let's go ahead and try to solve a problem. So this is called the Tower of Hanoi puzzle, and looking at the left side of the screen marked Start, we're going to work with those 3 discs and those 3 pegs. So the rules are that you can only move 1 disc at a time, and no disc can ever cover a smaller disc. And the goal is to move all 3 discs to the 3rd post, arranged in the same order that they are in the first post, or like you see there in the part of the screen marked Finish, with that block of wood and the 3 pegs and the discs to the right. So we're working with the Start side, but we're trying to, the goal is to get our discs to look how they look on the wood labeled Finish. And again, the rules are that only 1 disc can be moved at a time, and no disc can cover a smaller disc. So go ahead and get out a piece of scratch paper and try to write down the moves that you would make. So if your first move would be to move disc C to peg 2, you would write down C2, and so on and so forth. Give it a shot. If you haven't done so already, it might be helpful to pause the video on the Tower of Hanoi picture. Okay, so the answer is that you would move C to 3, disc B to peg 2, disc C to peg 2, A to 3, C to 1, B to 3, and then C to 3. So psychologists have found that the way people solve puzzles in a laboratory setting is the same way that they go about solving problems in real life. So in the lab, if they try to cheat, then it's found that they are probably people who try to find shortcuts and cheat in real life. If they think that the problem's too hard and they can't do it in the lab, that's generally how they approach problems in the real world. They just give up or don't even try in the first place. So problem solving involves 3 steps: preparation, production, and judgment. And that's what we are going to look at now, starting with preparation. So the very first step in problem solving is preparation. And in preparation, there's really 2 things that we do. We try to understand and diagnose the problem. So we want to understand the problem thoroughly. Is it complicated? What are the restrictions? What are the rules? And we also want to diagnose the problem. Is it a well-defined problem, like a math equation, or is it an ill-defined problem, like the crisis in the Middle East? Typically, problems fall into these 3 categories. The first type of problem is called an arrangement problem. And with arrangement problems, we attempt to rearrange or recombine elements to meet a criteria. For example, rearranging letters to make a word, like in a word scramble. So if you look at the slide on the top where it's labeled arrangement problems, you'll see what looks like those little Scrabble pieces that hold your Scrabble letters. And those are word jumbles, so try to unscramble the words or rearrange those letters to make a word. So the answers going left to right would be facet, doubt, thick, naive, and anvil. The next type of problem is called problems of inducing structure. And here a person must identify the existing relationships among elements and then construct a new one. Analogies are problems of inducing structure, or trying to find the next piece in a pattern would be an example of problems of inducing structure. So if you look on the screen, you're going to see an analogy there. Baseball is to bat as tennis is to racket. So you have to identify the relationship between sport and sporting equipment to be able to solve this analogy. And then the pattern is 1 4 2 4 3 4 4 4 5 4 6 4 7 would be the next number in the pattern. And the last type of problem are transformation problems. And with transformation problems, there is an initial state, a goal state, and a method from getting to the goal state from the initial state. So the Tower of Hanoi problem was a transformation problem, and if you look at the screen, you'll see all these pennies here. And the goal is to end up with 6 pennies in the column and 6 pennies in the row. So it's going to be a perpendicular shape, just like you have here across. But instead of having the number of pennies in the column and row that there are now, you're going to have 6 in the column and 6 in the row. But the rule is that you can only move 2 coins. So give it a shot. So to solve this problem, what you would need to do is take the penny that's in the bottom of the column and move it to the right of the row of pennies, and then take the second penny towards the bottom, or now the bottom penny, and stack it in the very middle on top of the penny in the middle of the cross, so that you have 6 going down and 6 going across. One issue that affects the way we solve problems is the way that the problem is framed. So I'm going to show you 2 scenarios now, and the question is, if you had cancer, what treatment option would you choose? But before you decide, let me tell you some facts about both surgery and radiation. So out of 100 people that had surgery, 10 people died during it, 32 people died 1 year later, and 66 people died 5 years later. Out of 100 people that had radiation, no one died during it, 23 people died 1 year later, and 78 people died 5 years later. So when psychologists ask people which they would prefer, surgery or radiation, based on the information framed this way, they tend to choose radiation because no one dies during it. But when we frame the information differently or present it with the same numbers, just worded differently, people make a different choice. So here, out of 100 people that got surgery, 90 people lived through it, 68 people are alive 1 year later, and 34 people are alive 5 years later. Where with radiation, all 100 people lived through it, 77 people are alive 1 year later, and only 22 people are alive 5 years later. So when information is framed this way or presented this way, people tend to choose surgery because 34 people are alive 5 years later, even though these numbers are exactly the same as they were in the previous slide. It's just that here it's flipped to focus on life, where on the previous it was focused on death. The second step in problem solving is production. In production, we try to find solutions to the problems. One type of production involves trial and error. In trial and error, the main con is, depending on the problem, finding a solution can take a lifetime. For example, Thomas Edison tried thousands of materials when inventing the light bulb. Imagine if you forgot your ATM PIN code. You could try all possible 4-digit combinations of the numbers 0 through 9, and it could take days to get the right combination. The next type of method of producing a solution to a problem is means-ends analysis. With means-ends analysis, we use a heuristic in which the difference between the starting situation and the goal is determined, and then steps are taken to reduce that difference. Means-ends analysis involves creating subgoals. So imagine that you're at school and you want In-N-Out. You have to figure out what means you have to get you to In-N-Out and what you don't have. So if you're at school, you have the issue of time. Probably you have to wait until your class gets out to be able to leave. And then let's say that you don't have any money that day, so you have the issue of money and coming up with money. And then finally, your car's in the shop, so you don't have any transportation. So you could think about ways that you could meet each of those sub-goals with the solution to get to the grand solution of getting to In-N-Out. So maybe you convince your teacher to cancel class early, you ask a peer to give you some money, and then you hop on the bus and take that bus to In-N-Out to get some food. The next way to produce a solution to a problem is insight, and this is when the solution to a problem seems to suddenly come to mind. Imagine that you put a coin in a bottle, and then you put the cork in that bottle. Besides breaking the bottle or pulling out the cork, how can you get the coin out? In this example of insight, the answer would just sort of suddenly come to mind in a lot of cases, and the answer would be to push the cork in and then shake the coin out. So insight can sometimes seem like magic, like the answer just came to you out of nowhere. But usually the mind has just reorganized the problem, allowing you to consider it another way. And then the last method of producing a solution is working backwards. And when you work backwards, you focus on a goal rather than the starting point. For example, solving a murder would be working backwards. And the last step in problem solving is judgment. During judgment, we judge the adequacy of the solution that we came up with during problem solving. This is easy to do with a math problem because you can check your work, you can do the problem backwards. However, if there is no single correct solution, then judgment becomes difficult. Sometimes you have to decide between which alternative solution is best, and we have a tendency to inaccurately estimate the quality of our own ideas. And the reason that we do this, in part, is due to confirmation bias. So confirmation bias is the tendency to favor information that supports our hypothesis and ignore contradictory evidence. Let's watch this video on confirmation bias.
Hey, what's up? It's conjecture, and I have a pattern for you to guess. This pattern consists of 3 numbers, and the only example I'll give you that fits the pattern is 2, 4, 6. When presented with this challenge, people typically propose sequences like 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, or 20, 22, 24. And those sequences are all correct, they fit my pattern. But if you were to guess that the pattern is increasing series of even numbers, that'd be incorrect. Now, maybe by this point you give up, or instead decide to try something you don't think will work, like 3, 5, 7. But then I'll say, yeah, that works. So let's say you try 3, 5, 8. Yeah, that works. And maybe by this point you think you're getting there, but you're still not really sure, and it's all just confusing, so you say something like 2, 3, 1. And then I finally say, no, that doesn't fit my pattern. If you haven't figured it out already, my pattern is any series of increasing numbers. 1, 2, 3, 2, 4, 6, 10, 20, 30. But when people heard that 2, 4, 6 fit the pattern, they generated a hypothesis for what the pattern was. So every time they proposed a new sequence and I said, yes, that fits my pattern, they became more confident that their hypothesis was correct. This experiment, first conducted in 1960 by psychologist Peter Wason, demonstrates what's known as the confirmation bias, the tendency to confirm what we already believe to be true. A bias is any notion that predisposes us towards a certain assumption, and the confirmation bias leads us to proposing explanations that confirm our beliefs. YouTuber Veritasium recently published a video demonstrating the confirmation bias, where he asked people to discover his pattern. And just like Peter Wason found in 1960, very few people were able to. Now, we probably encounter this bias simply because it's easier to confirm things we believe than to prove them wrong. For example, when we first discovered fire and someone was burned by it, we believed that the fire did that to them. We weren't 100% sure, maybe there were other things we weren't aware of that could have actually burned them. But the only way to test that for sure would have been to stick our hands into the fire. So this bias is still around because it protects us from things that would probably hurt us, like sticking our hand in fire. Despite its helpfulness, the confirmation bias can hinder our perceptions of reality, and this often has greater implications than just messing up a simple pattern game. Think politics. We often surround ourselves with people and get our news from sources that will confirm what we already believe. So if we're not able to look at the other side of things, then we'll never be able to understand how we could ever be wrong, and might wind up with a situation like this. But that's okay, because I'm sure that will never happen! There are some things we know with absolute certainty in this world, because those things have survived the strongest attempts to disprove them. Proving ourselves wrong or having someone else do it sucks, but that's the only way we'll ever know what is right. Thanks for watching.
So let's talk about what prevents us from being able to solve a problem. The first impediment to a solution that we're going to look at is mental sets. So a mental set is the tendency for people to persist in using problem-solving patterns that have worked for them in the past. We have default patterns that we rely on, but they don't work for every problem, and sometimes it's hard to get past that. The next impediment to a solution is functional fixedness. Functional fixedness is a block to problem solving that comes from thinking about objects in terms of their typical functions. For example, thinking of a book as only for reading and not as a doorstop or to start a fire. So what we're going to do now is go ahead and pause the video, head on over to lecture activity number 1, and we're going to take a more in-depth look at impediments to solutions. When you finish the lecture activity, come back to this point in the video. A lot of students ask me what makes one person more creative than another person, and it's actually hard to determine why some people are more creative than others. We define creativity as the ability to generate original ideas or solve problems in novel ways. There's divergent thinking, which is kind of the fancy term for creative thinking, and this is the ability to generate unusual yet nonetheless appropriate responses to problems or questions. For example, what do you do with a newspaper? A divergent thinker would say, use it as a dustpan, whereas a convergent thinker, who is a person who thinks in terms of being able to converge on one common or correct answer, might say you read the newspaper. So convergent thinking is less creative thinking. It's the ability to produce responses that are based primarily on knowledge and logic. Creative people generally have what we call cognitive complexity, which is a preference for intricate, elaborate, and complex stimuli and thinking patterns. They often have a wider range of interests, are more independent, and are more interested in philosophical or abstract problems. Intelligence is actually not closely related with creativity, but most intelligence tests may actually inhibit a creative person's ability to use their divergent thinking. You can't really think outside of the box on a multiple choice test because there is only one right answer to converge on. So multiple choice tests that look at intelligence are really favoring the convergent thinker, and this could be why we're not finding a significant correlation between intelligence and creativity. So let's discuss the idea of intelligence. Defining intelligence is actually not easy, and it can depend on a variety of factors. For example, your culture. Perhaps you live in the Australian outback. Well, in the Australian outback, intelligence is defined as being a good hunter. Whereas if you are from Miami, maybe intelligence is defined as being streetwise. One study found that Westerners define intelligence as the ability to form categories and debate rationally, whereas Easterners define intelligence as the ability to understand and relate to each other. So we know that culture can shape the idea of what intelligence is, but is there just one type of intelligence, or are there different kinds? For example, we talk about street smarts versus book smarts all the time. So should there be one general definition of intelligence? It seems as though intelligence is maybe more complex and dynamic than it can be summed up with one definition. So while we're not necessarily all in agreement in psychology if intelligence should have one definition, this is the one that we have kind of settled on for now. So the definition of intelligence is the ability to learn from one's experiences, acquire knowledge, and use resources effectively in adapting to new situations or solving problems. If you think about yourself and you were to write down all of the subjects in school that you would consider yourself good at, is there specific subjects or are there many? Are you a science person or a literature person? Or are you good at pretty much all of the different fields of study? Spearman was a gentleman who decided that there should be one single general factor for mental ability, which is assumed to underlie intelligence in some earlier theories of intelligence. However, like you just kind of thought about when you were to think about all of the different subjects you're good at, maybe it's not appropriate to have one single general factor to assess someone's entire mental ability, since it seems as though mental ability and intelligence is complex and might be situational. So Spearman said that the one factor that we should use to sum up a person's intelligence should be referred to as the G factor, or a measure of their general ability. And this is what psychologists tend to measure on intelligences tests. However, now we are considering theories that look at intelligence as multidimensional and include different types of intelligence. So before we look at those theories, let's go ahead and watch a TED Talk that focuses more on this issue of defining creativity and its relationship to intelligence, and seeing if maybe we've been kind of going about it wrong.
Good morning. How are you? It's been great, hasn't it? I've been blown away by the whole thing. In fact, I'm leaving. There have been three themes, haven't there, running through the conference, which are relevant to what I want to talk about. One is the extraordinary evidence of human creativity in all of the presentations that we've had and in all the people here. Just the variety of it and the range of it. The second is that it's put us in a place where we have no idea what's going to happen in terms of the future. No idea how this may play out. I have an interest in education. Actually, what I find is everybody has an interest in education. Don't you? I find this very interesting. If you're at a dinner party and you say you work in education, actually, you're not often at dinner parties, frankly, if you work in education. You're not asked, you know, and you're never asked back, curiously. That's I think it strikes me. But if you are, and you say to somebody, they say, what do you do? And you say, you work in education, you can see the blood run from their face. They think, oh my God, you know, why me? It's my one night out all week. But if you ask people about their education, they pin you to the wall. Because it's one of those things that goes deep with people. Am I right? Like religion and money and other things. So I have a big interest in education, and I think we all do. We have a huge vested interest in it, partly because it's education that's meant to take us into this future that we can't grasp. If you think of it, children starting school this year will be retiring in 2065. Nobody has a clue, despite all the expertise that's been on parade for the past 4 days, what the world will look like in 5 years' time. And yet we're meant to be educating them for it. So the unpredictability, I think, is extraordinary. And the third part of this is that we've all agreed, nonetheless, on the really extraordinary capacities that children have, their capacities for innovation. I mean, Serena last night was a marvel, wasn't she? Just seeing what she could do. And she's exceptional, but I think she's not, so to speak, exceptional in the whole of childhood. What you have there is a person of extraordinary dedication who found a talent. And my contention is all kids have tremendous talents, and we squander them pretty ruthlessly. So I want to talk about education, and I want to talk about creativity. My contention is that creativity now is as important in education as literacy, and we should treat it with the same status. Thank you. That was it, by the way. Thank you very much. So, 15 minutes left. Well, I was born... No, I had a great story recently, I love telling it, of a little girl who was in a drawing lesson. She was 6, and she was at the back drawing, and the teacher said, this little girl hardly ever paid attention. And in this drawing lesson, she did. And the teacher was fascinated. She went over to her, and she said, what are you drawing? And the girl said, I'm drawing a picture of God. And the teacher said, but nobody knows what God looks like. And the girl said, they will in a minute. When my son was 4 in England, actually he was 4 everywhere, to be honest. I mean, if we're being strict about it, wherever he went, he was 4 that year. But he was in the Nativity play. Do you remember the story? No, it was big. It was a big story. Mel Gibson did the sequel. You may have seen it. I don't know. It was Nativity 2. But James got the part of Joseph, which we were thrilled about. We consider this to be one of the lead parts. We had the place crammed full of agents and T-shirts, you know. James Robinson is Joseph. He didn't have to speak, but do you know the bit where the three kings come in? They come in bearing gifts, and they bring gold, frankincense, and myrrh. This really happened. We're sitting there, and they, I think, just went out of sequence. Because we talked to the little boy afterwards and said, you know, are you OK with that? And they said, yeah, why was that wrong? They just switched. I think that was it. Anyway, the three boys came in, little 4-year-olds with tea towels on their heads, and they put these boxes down. The first boy said, I bring you gold. And the second boy said, I bring you myrrh. And the third boy said, Frank sent this. What these things have in common, you see, is that kids will take a chance. You know, if they don't know, they'll have a go. Am I right? They're not frightened of being wrong. Now, I don't mean to say that being wrong is the same thing as being creative. What we do know is, if you're not prepared to be wrong, you'll never come up with anything original. If you're not prepared to be wrong. And by the time they get to be adults, most kids have lost that capacity. They have become frightened of being wrong. And we run our companies this, by the way. We stigmatize mistakes. And we're now running national education systems where mistakes are the worst thing you can make. And the result is that we are educating people out of their creative capacities. Picasso once said this. He said that all children are born artists. The problem is to remain an artist as we grow up. I believe this passionately, that we don't grow into creativity, we grow out of it. Or rather, we get educated out of it. So why is this? I lived in Stratford-on-Avon until about 5 years ago. In fact, we moved from Stratford to Los Angeles. So you can imagine what a seamless transition, you know, this was from LA. Actually, we lived in a place called Snitterfield, just outside Stratford, which is where Shakespeare's father was born. Are you struck by a new thought? I was. You don't think of Shakespeare having a father, do you? Do you? Because you don't think of Shakespeare being a child. Do you? Shakespeare being 7. I never thought of it. I mean, he was 7 at some point. He was in somebody's English class, wasn't he? Do you understand? Really? How annoying would that be? You know? Must try harder. Being sent to bed by his dad, to Shakespeare. Go to bed now, you know, to William Shakespeare, you know, and put the pencil down, you know, and stop speaking like that. You know, it's confusing everybody. Anyway, we moved from Stratford to Los Angeles, and I just want to say a word about the transition. Actually, my son didn't want to come. I've got 2 kids. He's 21 now, and my daughter's 16. He didn't want to come to Los Angeles. He loved it, but he had a girlfriend in England. This was the love of his life, Sarah. He'd known her for a month. Mind you, they'd had their 4th anniversary by then, because it's a long time when you're 16. Anyway, he was really upset on the plane. He said, I'll never find another girl like Sarah. And we were rather pleased about that, frankly, because she was the main reason we were leaving the country. But something strikes you when you move to America and when you travel around the world. Every education system on Earth has the same hierarchy of subjects. Everyone, doesn't matter where you go. You think it would be otherwise, but it isn't. At the top are mathematics and languages, then the humanities, and at the bottom are the arts, everywhere on Earth. And in pretty much every system, too, there's a hierarchy within the arts. Art and music are normally given a higher status in schools than drama and dance. There isn't an education system on the planet that teaches dance every day to children the way we teach them mathematics. Why? Why not? I think this is rather important. I think maths is very important, but so is dance. Children dance all the time if they're allowed to. We all do. We all have bodies, don't we? You know, did I miss a meeting? I mean, I think... Truthfully, what happens is, as children grow up, we start to educate them progressively from the waist up. And then we focus on their heads, and slightly to one side. If you were to visit education as an alien and say, what's it for, public education, I think you'd have to conclude, if you look at the output, you know, who really succeeds by this? Who does everything they should? Who gets all the brownie points? You know, who are the winners? I think you'd have to conclude the whole purpose of public education throughout the world is to produce university professors, isn't it? They're the people who come out the top. And I used to be one, so there, you know. And I like university professors, but, you know, we shouldn't hold them up as the high watermark of all human achievement. They're just a form of life, you know, another form of life. But they're rather curious, and I say this out of affection for them. There's something curious about professors. In my experience, not all of them, but typically, they live in their heads. They live up there, and slightly to one side. They're disembodied, you know, in a kind of literal way. You know, they look upon their body as a form of transport for their heads. You know, it's... Don't they? It's a way of getting their head to meetings. If you want real evidence of out-of-body experiences, by the way, get yourself along to a residential conference for senior academics and pop into the discotheque on the final night. And there you will see it. Grown men and women writhing uncontrollably off the beat. Waiting to end so they can go home and write a paper about it. Now, our education system is predicated on the idea of academic ability. And there's a reason. The whole system was invented around the world. There were no public systems of education really before the 19th century. They all came into being to meet the needs of industrialism. So the hierarchy is rooted on two ideas. Number one, that the most useful subjects for work are at the top. So you were probably steered benignly away from things at school when you were a kid, things you liked, on the grounds you would never get a job doing that. Is that right? Don't do music, you're not going to be a musician. Don't do art, you won't be an artist. Benign advice, now profoundly mistaken. The whole world is engulfed in a revolution. And the second is academic ability, which has really come to dominate our view of intelligence because the universities designed the system in their image. If you think of it, the whole system of public education around the world is a protracted process of university entrance. And the consequence is that many highly talented, brilliant, creative people think they're not, because the thing they were good at school wasn't valued or was actually stigmatized. And I think we can't afford to go on that way. In the next 30 years, according to UNESCO, more people worldwide will be graduating through education than since the beginning of history. More people. And it's the combination of all the things we've talked about, technology and its transformational effect on work, and demography and the huge explosion in population. Suddenly, degrees aren't worth anything. Isn't that true? When I was a student, if you had a degree, you had a job. If you didn't have a job, it's because you didn't want one. And I didn't want one, frankly. So, but now, kids with degrees are often heading home to carry on playing video games because you need an MA, where the previous job required a BA, and now you need a PhD for the other. It's a process of academic inflation, and it indicates the whole structure of education is shifting beneath our feet. We need to radically rethink our view of intelligence. We know three things about intelligence. One, it's diverse. We think about the world in all the ways that we experience it. We think visually, we think in sound, we think kinesthetically, we think in abstract terms, we think in movement. Secondly, intelligence is dynamic. If you look at the interactions of a human brain, as we heard yesterday from a number of presentations, intelligence is wonderfully interactive. The brain isn't divided into compartments. In fact, creativity, which I define as the process of having original ideas that have value, more often than not, comes about through the interaction of different disciplinary ways of seeing things. The brain is intentionally, by the way, there's a shaft of nerves that joins the two halves of the brain called the corpus callosum. It's thicker in women. Following on from Helen yesterday, I think this is probably why women are better at multitasking. Because you are, aren't you? There's a raft of research, but I know it from my personal life. If my wife is cooking a meal at home, which is not often, thankfully, but, you know, if she's doing... No, she's good at some things. But if she's cooking, you know, she's dealing with people on the phone, she's talking to the kids, she's painting the ceiling, you know, she's doing open heart surgery over here. If I'm cooking, the door is shut, the kids are out, the phone's on the hook. If she comes in, I get annoyed. I say, Terry, please, I'm trying to fry an egg in here. You know, give me a break. Actually, there was, do you know that old philosophical thing? If a tree falls in a forest and nobody hears it, did it happen? Remember that old chestnut? I saw a great T-shirt really recently which said, if a man speaks his mind in a forest and no woman hears him, is he still wrong? And the third thing about intelligence is it's distinct. I'm doing a new book at the moment called Epiphany, which is based on a series of interviews with people about how they discovered their talent. I'm fascinated by how people got to be there. It's really prompted by a conversation I had with a wonderful woman who most people have never heard of. She's called Gillian Lynn. Have you heard of her? Some have. She's a choreographer, and everybody knows her work. She did Cats and Phantom of the Opera. She's wonderful. I used to be on the board of the Royal Ballet in England, as you can see. And anyway, Gillian and I had lunch one day. I said, how'd you get to be a dancer? And she said it was interesting. When she was at school, she was really hopeless. And the school in the 30s wrote to her parents and said, we think Gillian has a learning disorder. She couldn't concentrate. She was fidgeting. I think now they'd say she had ADHD. Wouldn't you? But this was the 1930s, and ADHD hadn't been invented, at this point. So it wasn't an available condition. People weren't aware they could have that. Anyway, she went to see this specialist. So this oak-panelled room, and she was there with her mother, and she was led and sat on this chair at the end, and she sat on her hands for 20 minutes while this man talked to her mother about all the problems Gillian was having at school. And at the end of it, because she was disturbing people, their homework was always late and so on, little kid of 8, in the end, the doctor went and sat next to Gillian and said, Gillian, I've listened to all these things that your mother's told me. I need to speak to her privately. So he said, wait here, we'll be back. We won't be very long. And they went and left her. But as they went out the room, he turned on the radio that was sitting on his desk. And when they got out the room, he said to her mother, just stand and watch her. And the minute they left the room, she said she was on her feet, moving to the music. And they watched for a few minutes, and he turned to her mother, and he said, Mrs. Lynn, Gillian isn't sick. She's a dancer. Take her to a dance school. I said, what happened? He said, she did. I can't tell you how wonderful it was. We walked in this room, and it was full of people like me. People who couldn't sit still. People who had to move to think. Who had to move to think. They did ballet, they did tap, they did jazz, they did modern, they did contemporary. She was eventually auditioned for the Royal Ballet School. She became a soloist. She had a wonderful career at the Royal Ballet. She eventually graduated from the Royal Ballet School, found her own company, the Gillian Dance Company, met Andrew Lloyd Webber. She's been responsible for some of the most successful musical theatre productions in history. She's given pleasure to millions, and she's a multi-millionaire. Somebody else might have put her on medication and told her to calm down. Now, I think... What I think it comes to is this. Al Gore spoke the other night about ecology and the revolution that was triggered by Rachel Carson. I believe our only hope for the future is to adopt a new conception of human ecology, one in which we start to reconstitute our conception of the richness of human capacity. Our education system has mined our minds in the way that we strip mine the earth for a particular commodity, and for the future, it won't serve us. We have to rethink the fundamental principles on which we're educating our children. There was a wonderful quote by Jonas Salk, who said, if all the insects were to disappear from the earth, within 50 years, all life on earth would end. If all human beings disappeared from the earth, within 50 years, all forms of life would flourish. And he's right. What TED celebrates is the gift of the human imagination. We have to be careful now that we use this gift wisely and that we avert some of the scenarios that we've talked about. And the only way we'll do it is by seeing our creative capacities for the richness they are and seeing our children for the hope that they are. And our task is to educate their whole being so they can face this future. By the way, we may not see this future, but they will. And our job is to help them make something of it. Thank you very much.
Bravo. Here, here.
Howard Gardner is a psychologist, and his theory asks the question, how are you smart? Instead of asking the question, how smart are you? He doesn't think that we should be looking at Spearman's G factor or finding just one number to sum up someone's very complex and multidimensional intelligence. Instead, he thinks that we should start looking at the multiple intelligences that human beings have. So Gardner's intelligence theory that proposes there are 8 distinct spheres of intelligence is called the theory of multiple intelligences, and each intelligence is linked to an independent system in the brain. Recently, Gardner has suggested that there might be a 9th intelligence. So we'll go over the different types of intelligences you see here, but just be aware that there is a suggested 9th intelligence, which he refers to as existential intelligence, which involves thinking about the questions of human existence. Why are we here? What happens when we die? What is the point of life? He says that people that would be sort of strong in this type of intelligence might be like the Dalai Lama or Deepak Chopra, for example. So Gardner argues that everyone has all 8 intelligences, just to different degrees, and they work simultaneously. This theory has led to development of tests with multiple correct answers and curriculum that meets students' needs. So the first type of intelligence is verbal linguistic intelligence, and these people tend to be really strong at reading and writing. They sort of focus on vocabulary words in class. They might become poets or writers. Eminem could be argued to be very strong in verbal linguistic intelligence. Next type of intelligence is logical mathematical intelligence, and people that are strong in this type of intelligence tend to be very analytical, strong in reasoning skills, critical thinkers. They enjoy science and math, experimentation. And the next type of intelligence is visual spatial intelligence. These people tend to be really strong in art or mapping, architecture, putting things in a trunk, driving somewhere one time and remembering how to get there forever without needing directions ever again. And research shows that people that are visual spatial actually tend to retain more information during a lecture-based course if they are actually doodling in the margins of their notes while listening. The next type of intelligence is bodily kinesthetic, and people that are bodily kinesthetic intelligence need to sort of move to keep their brain engaged. They also tend to be really good at athletic ability, dance, anything that has to do with usage of tools or movement. They're sort of hands-on learners. So bodily kinesthetic people often take jobs in construction or acting or sports, anywhere where they're able to involve their physical movement in their whatever they're doing. People that have musical intelligence often become composers or musicians. They have a natural propensity to hear and understand music very clearly. They might become singers or rappers, play an instrument. They tend to learn best or work best when music is playing in the background. If they want to retain information, it's especially helpful to try to make a mnemonic device with a song, for example. The next type of intelligence is interpersonal intelligence, and these people are sometimes referred to as being people smart. They are great leaders and teammates. They know how to motivate people and interact and get along with others. They're great teachers. People tend to like being around them and feel comfortable with them. They have a way of just making people feel at ease and interacting with people in a way that sort of brings out the best in the other person generally. And then the next type is intrapersonal, and these people are self-aware, self-smart. They're able to be kind of their authentic self. They understand what makes them tick. They understand the basis for their behaviors, what their strengths and weaknesses are, and there is a lot of benefit to being a self-aware person in life. Research shows that self-aware people tend to make more money, they live longer, they're happier, they have more friends. People tend to respond to authentic individuals who are being true to themselves. And then the last type of intelligence is naturalistic intelligence. Bear Grylls, Survivor Man, these would be examples of people with naturalistic intelligence. They kind of thrive in nature. I always like to say that they're the people that could take a magnifying glass and a stick and somehow turn it into a Kia. They just kind of are in their element when they are outside with animals, with the trees, in nature. So if you are a person that is strong in naturalistic intelligence, it could behoove you to study outside when you're studying for exams for your college courses. All right, so what we're going to do now is we are going to listen to a video of Howard Gardner discussing his theory.
We have schools because we hope that someday when children have left schools that they will still be able to use what it is that they've learned. And there is now a massive amount of evidence from all realms of science that unless individuals take a very active role in what it is that they're studying, unless they learn to ask questions, to do things hands-on, to essentially recreate things in their own mind and then transform them as is needed, the ideas just disappear. The student may have a good grade on the exam. We may think that he or she is learning, but a year or two later, there's nothing left. If, on the other hand, somebody has carried out an experiment himself or herself, analyzed the data, made a prediction and saw whether it came out correctly, if somebody is doing history and actually does some interviewing himself or herself, oral histories, then reads the documents, listens to it, goes back and asks further questions, writes up a paper, that's the kind of thing that's going to adhere, where if you simply memorize a bunch of names and a bunch of facts and even a bunch of definitions, there's nothing to hold on to. The idea of multiple intelligences comes out of psychology. It's a theory that was developed to document the fact that human beings have very different kinds of intellectual strengths, and that these strengths are very, very important in how kids learn, and how people represent things in their minds, and then how people use them in order to show what it is that they've understood. If we all had exactly the same kind of mind and there was only one kind of intelligence, then we could teach everybody the same thing in the same way and assess them in the same way, and that would be fair. But once we realize that people have very different kinds of minds, different kinds of strengths, some people are good in thinking spatially, some people are good in thinking language, other people are very logical, other people need to do hands-on, they need to actually explore actively and to try things out. Once we realize that, then an education which treats everybody the same way is actually the most unfair education, because it picks out one kind of mind, which I call the law professor mind, somebody who's very linguistic and logical, and says, if you think like that, great. If you don't think like that, there's no room in the train for you. If we know that one child has a very spatial or visual spatial way of learning, another child has a very hands-on way of learning, a third child likes to ask deep philosophical questions, a fourth child likes stories. We don't have to talk very fast as a teacher. We can actually provide software, we can provide materials, we can provide resources which present material to a child in a way in which the child will find interesting and will be able to use his or her intelligences productively, and to the extent that the technology is interactive, the child will actually be able to show his or her understanding in a way that's comfortable to the child. We have this myth that the only way to learn something is read it in a textbook or hear a lecture on it, and the only way to show that we've understood something is to take a short answer test, or maybe occasionally with an essay question thrown in. But that's nonsense. Everything can be taught in more than one way, and anything that's understood can be shown in more than one way. I don't believe because there are 8 intelligences we have to teach things 8 ways. I think that's silly. But we always ought to be asking ourselves, are we reaching every child? And if not, are there other ways in which we can do it? I think that we teach way too many subjects and we cover way too much material, and the end result is that students have a very superficial knowledge, as we often say, a mile wide and an inch deep, and then once they leave school, almost everything's been forgotten. And I think that school needs to change to have a few priorities and to really go into those priorities very deeply. So let's take the area of science. I actually don't care if a child studies physics or biology or geology or astronomy before he goes to college. There's plenty of time to do that kind of detailed work. I think what's really important is to begin to learn to think scientifically, to understand what a hypothesis is, how to test it out and see whether it's working or not. If it's not working, how to revise your theory about things. That takes time. There's no way you can present that in a week or indeed even in a month. You have to learn about it from doing many different kinds of experiments, seeing when the results are like what you predicted, seeing when they're different, and so on. But if you really focus on science in that kind of way, by the time you go to college, or if you don't go to college, by the time you go to workplace, you'll know the difference between a statement which is simply a matter of opinion or prejudice and one for which there's solid evidence. The most important thing about assessment is knowing what it is that you should be able to do. And the best way for me to think about it is a child learning a sport or a child learning an art form. Because there it's completely unmysterious what you have to be a quarterback or a figure skater or a violin player. You see it, you try it out, you're coached, you know when you're getting better, you know how you're doing compared to other kids. In school, assessment is mystifying. Nobody knows what's going to be on the test, and when the test results go back, neither the teacher nor the student knows what to do. So what I favor is highlighting for kids from the day they walk into school, what are the performances and what are the exhibitions for which they're going to be accountable. Let's get real. Let's look at the kinds of things that we really value in the world. Let's be as explicit as we can. Let's provide feedback to kids from as early as possible, and then let them internalize the feedback so they themselves can say what's going well, what's not going so well. I'm a writer, and initially I had to have a lot of feedback from editors, including a lot of rejections. But over time, I learned what was important. I learned to edit myself, and now the feedback from editors is much less necessary. And I think anybody as an adult knows that as you get to be more expert in things, you don't have to do so much external critiquing. You can do what we call self-assessment. And in school, assessment shouldn't be something that's done to you. It should be something where you are the most active agent. I think for there to be long-standing change in American education that is widespread rather than just on the margins, first of all, people have to see examples of places which are like their own places where the new kind of education really works, where students are learning deeply, where they can exhibit their knowledge publicly, and where everybody who looks at the kids says, that's the kind of kids I want to have. So we need to have enough good examples. Second of all, we need to have the individuals who are involved in education, primarily teachers and administrators, believe in this, really want to do it, and get the kind of help that they need in order to be able to switch, so to speak, from a teacher-centered, let's stuff it into the kid's mind kind of education to one where the preparation is behind the scenes and the child himself or herself is at the center of learning. Third of all, I think we need to have assessment schemes which really convince everybody that this kind of education is working. It does no good to have child-centered learning and then have the same old multiple choice tests which were used 50 or 100 years ago. Finally, I think there has to be a political commitment which says that this is kind of education which we want to have in our country and maybe outside this country for the foreseeable future. And as long as people are busy bashing teachers or saying that we can't try anything new because it might fail, then reform will be stifled as it has been in the past.
For more information on what works in public education, go to edutopia.org.
Okay, go ahead and pause the video, head on over to Moodle, complete lecture activity number 2, and when you finish, come back to this point in the video. See you then. There's also a theory that there are two main types of intelligence, fluid intelligence and crystallized intelligence. So fluid intelligence is defined as intelligence that reflects information processing capabilities, reasoning, and memory. This would be like a general kind of intelligence. The ability to solve an analogy or remember numbers, rapidly solve a puzzle. The next type of intelligence is crystallized intelligence. This is defined as the accumulation of information, skills, and strategies that are learned through experience and can be applied in problem-solving situations. Crystallized intelligence relies on our long-term memory and is a reflection of the culture in which we were raised, as well as our experiences, our knowledge. So if you were to participate in a discussion on finding a solution to poverty, this would require your usage of your crystallized intelligence. What we find is that as people age, they usually show a decline in fluid intelligence, but their crystallized intelligence stays strong and in some cases even increases. Robert Sternberg suggests that there are 3 types of intelligence: analytical, creative, and practical intelligence. He suggests that analytical intelligence is for people that are really strong in their reasoning skills and logic and analysis, math and science. He says that analytical intelligence is assessed by intelligence tests that have well-defined problems and have a single right answer, like a math problem. What we find is that these type of tests are really good at predicting school success and vocational success. The next type of intelligence, according to Sternberg, is creative intelligence. So creative meaning coming up with solutions that work but are not necessarily obvious. And he says that this can be demonstrated in reacting adaptively to novel situations and novel ideas. So this type of intelligence might be best assessed by showing someone a cartoon like the one that you see here on the slide and asking them to think up a caption for this untitled cartoon. If you are able to think of one that's maybe not very obvious, but funny or a different kind of take on what Tigger is doing here, then you would score high in creative intelligence. And the last type of intelligence, according to Sternberg, is practical intelligence. And this is intelligence related to overall success in living. So traditional tests do not measure career success, which is very different from academic success. People high on practical intelligence are quick to learn general norms and principles and apply them appropriately. So when they're in the workplace, they know how to interact with their boss, they know how to climb the corporate ladder, they know to go stand by the water cooler at lunchtime and build relationships. So to test people on practical intelligence, tests give scenarios and then measure one's ability to solve real-life problems. For example, a test question might say, one of your employees comes up to you crying and says they are having a bad day. What do you do? And a person that's strong in practical intelligence might find a way to motivate that person to go back to work while being empathetic and kind, but also firm and fair. Emotional intelligence has recently seen a rise in research. It's becoming a topic that a lot of organizations and people in general are really interested in. Emotional intelligence is defined as the set of skills that underlie the accurate assessment, evaluation, expression, and regulation of emotions. People that are high in emotional intelligence tend to have a strong ability to get along with others. Our ability to understand what other people are feeling and experiencing and then respond accordingly is a measure of our emotional intelligence. People that are strong in emotional intelligence might help us to understand why people do badly on traditional tests but are still extremely successful, because they're able to get others to respond to them. So next time you're at work and you're wondering, how did this person become my boss? They can't even spell your correctly. Remember, emotional intelligence. Maybe they're just really good at building relationships and getting people motivated. Across 69 studies in many countries, those people scoring high in emotional intelligence exhibit modestly better job performance. They're more successful in their career, marriages, and parenting. They have higher quality interactions with their friends, and they are less likely to suffer from depression or anxiety. Check out this video on emotional intelligence.
Since the dawn of humanity, the understanding of well-being and rational decision-making has remained relatively unchanged. However, recent discoveries in neuroscience and psychology may fundamentally change long-held theories about emotions and reasoning. One recent study analyzed patients who had experienced damage to the amygdala, a primitive part of the brain that typically regulates emotions. What they discovered was that these patients had often lost their ability to feel emotions and make basic decisions. The implication of this discovery is that our decisions are not determined simply by logic or emotions alone, but rather a combination of the two. When we make a bad decision that affects our well-being, it is typically caused by an imbalance between our reasoning and our emotions. This process of understanding and facilitating emotions into rational thinking is known as emotional intelligence. Originally developed in 1990 by John Mayer, David Caruso, and Peter Salovey, the theory of emotional intelligence can be broken down into 4 simple aspects. 1. The ability to perceive emotion. For humans, cues like facial expressions and gestures can indicate complex emotions that influence our understanding of other people, such as happiness, sadness, anger, and fear. 2. Understanding emotions. Emotions convey information. For example, happiness usually indicates a desire to join with other people, sadness indicates a desire to avoid people, and so on. Each emotion conveys its own patterns of possible messages and actions associated with those messages. 3. Using emotions to facilitate thought. In recent years, cognitive scientists have discovered that emotions prioritize our thinking. Therefore, having a good system of emotional input can help you focus on things that truly matter. 4. Managing emotions. Managing emotions involves the ability to promote certain types of behavior through emotions and using them to your advantage. For example, if you're sad, you're more likely to be reflective and analytical. If you are happy, you're more likely to be social and outgoing. These 4 aspects that make up emotional intelligence inform our decisions, help predict life outcomes, and help us understand people in order to build healthy relationships.
So let's talk about assessing intelligence. We do that with intelligence tests. And these are tests devised to quantify a person's level of intelligence, sum a person's intelligence up using one number. And intelligence tests have been helpful in identifying students with special needs and helping people make career and collegiate decisions. However, their use is controversial. This is Sir Francis Galton, and he thought that the size and shape of one's brain equaled their intelligence. And this was really the first attempt at measuring intelligence. Of course, this intelligence test didn't actually measure intelligence because there is no significant correlation between the size of a person's head and their intelligence. So the first real intelligence test was developed by Alfred Binet in 1904, and his intelligence test was developed based on his idea that if performance on certain test items improved with age, then performance could be used to compare and determine intelligence. So in the beginning of the development of his intelligence test, he had teachers label students as bright or dull. And tasks that were successfully completed by the bright students ended up on the first intelligence test. So Binet developed the intelligence quotient, or the IQ, which is a score that takes into account an individual's mental and chronological ages. So their chronological age is their actual age, but mental age is the average age of individuals who achieve a particular level of performance on a test. So if you get 45 items right out of 50, then your mental age is 8, for example. The problem is this doesn't allow for adequate comparisons across age groups. A 20-year-old having a mental age of 18 is a much smaller deal than a 5-year-old having the mental age of a 3-year-old. There's a relative degree of slowness. However, with that being said, the IQ score can be calculated by taking a person's mental age, dividing it by their chronological age, and multiplying it by 100. For example, if you're a 20-year-old at an 18-year-old's mental age, you would take 18 divided by 20 times 100, and your IQ score would be 90. If you're a 5-year-old, but you're at a 3-year-old's mental age level, then you would take 3 divided by 5 times 100, and your IQ would be 60. The formula is multiplied by 100 because if your chronicle age and mental age are the same, then you would be at an IQ of 100. 100 also happens to be the average IQ score. Louis Terman, who was a Stanford University professor, adapted Binet's test and added and modified some of the answers. Now, we still use this test and are actually on the 5th edition of Binet's IQ test called the Stanford Binet Intelligence Scale. Items on this test vary based on a person's age. Young people are asked to copy figures, while older people are asked to solve analogies. And you still start by identifying a mental age where the person gets all the answers correct, and then you keep going until the person can't answer any questions. This test identifies a person's strengths and their weaknesses in terms of their intelligence. The scale you see on the slide here is from the very first Stanford Binet Intelligence. These terms, imbecile, idiot, are obviously no longer used in association with these particular IQ scores, or on any IQ test for that matter. All psychological testing must pass the tests of validity and reliability for the results to be considered meaningful. So, reliability refers to the tendency of a test to produce the same scores again and again each time it is given. So, if I were to use a ruler, I would want that ruler to measure the inch the same way it did the last time I used it. It should measure the same way every time I use it. Validity is the degree to which a test actually measures what it's supposed to measure. So, I have this old scale that my grandfather got from a garage sale. And when anyone stands on it, it says that that person weighs 999 pounds. So it's reliable, and that it always comes up with the same number, but it's not valid because it's not actually measuring anyone's weight. So a test can be reliable, but not necessarily valid. Sir Francis Galton was able to reliably measure the size of people's heads, but that did not measure intelligence. So while the test was reliable, it was not valid. But a test can never be valid if it's not reliable. If you score high on an intelligence test the first time you take it and low the second time, that test is not measuring what it's supposed to measure. Standardization refers to the process of giving a test to a large group of people that represents the kind of people for whom the test is designed. For example, if a test is designed for kids, then a large sample of randomly selected kids would be given the test under controlled conditions. Since we've controlled the conditions, we would be able to make sure that the outcomes we get are based on a standardized test that is both reliable and valid. And then norms are the scores from the standardized test that all the other scores are compared against. For example, if you scored in the top 15% of people who have taken a math test. Check out this video that talks about some of these issues in assessing intelligence, intelligence itself, and test construction.
Smarty pants, egghead, brainiac. You've heard terms like these before. Maybe you've even been on the receiving end of one of them. But actually defining intelligence is a lot trickier than just coming up with new names for smart people. I mean, intelligence isn't like height or weight. You can't just toss someone on a scale and get an exact measurement. It has different meanings for different cultures and ages and skill sets. So what is intelligence? That's a question that doesn't give us a lot of answers, but it does open up a bunch of other equally important and interesting questions. Like, what influences it? And how can it be assessed? Is it a single, general ability, or does it cover a range of aptitudes and skills and talents? How do things like creativity and innovation factor in, or genetics, environment, or education? And what about emotional intelligence? Most agree that it's best to think of intelligence not as a concrete thing so much as a concept. The ability to learn from experience, to solve problems, and use knowledge to adapt to new experiences. We've often used intelligence tests to assess and compare mental aptitude, but these tests have a long, complex, and dark history. I mean, there are Nazis involved, so Yeah, so as you'll see, there are reasons that intelligence is one of the most hotly debated subjects in psychology. It's complicated and controversial. What if I'm the world's greatest Rubik's Cube solver, but a terrible speller, or a truly gifted artist who's barely mastered long division? Could anyone say I was intelligent or not based on those different aptitudes, or would it be more accurate to measure my brain power on several different scales? Around the turn of the 20th century, British psychologist Charles Spearman suggested that yes, we do have one comprehensive general intelligence that underlies all of our specific mental abilities. He called it the G factor. Spearman conceded that while people may have special talents like basket weaving or saxophone solos or doing crossword puzzles, those things still fell under G. And he helped develop a statistical procedure called factor analysis to try to determine how certain clusters of skills might correlate with another one. Like, say, someone who tests well in spatial skills might be good with numbers. We might then refer to that cluster of skills, that factor, as spatial numeric reasoning. But to Spearman, the G factor was something of an uber factor, connected to all intelligent behavior from architecture to healing to survival skills, and it's why people who do well on one kind of cognitive test tend to do well on others. But as you can imagine, reducing intelligence to a single numerical test score was and is problematic. L.L. Thurstone, an American pioneer of psychometrics and one of Spearman's first challengers, was not into ranking people on a single scale. Thurstone administered 56 different tests to his subjects, then used them to identify 7 clusters of mental abilities. By this system, you might turn out to be great at like verbal comprehension, but less stellar at something like numerical ability. Sounds fair. But when researchers followed up on his findings, they actually did see that high scores in one aptitude usually meant good scores in the others, essentially backing up some evidence for some kind of G factor. Even though their ideas did not often align, Spearman and Thurstone together paved the way for more contemporary theories on intelligence. For example, American psychologist Howard Gardner views intelligence as multiple abilities that come in different forms. He references instances of brain damage where one ability may be destroyed while others stay perfectly intact. Savants usually have some limited mental abilities, but one exceptional ability when it comes to like computing figures or memorizing the complete works of Shakespeare. To Gardner, this suggests that we have multiple intelligences beyond the G factor. In fact, he believes that we have 8 intelligences, ranging from our skills with numbers and words to our ability to understand physical space and the natural world. American psychologist Robert Sternberg tends to agree with Gardner, though he boils them down into 3 intelligences: analytical or problem-solving intelligence, creative intelligence, or the ability to adapt to new situations, and practical intelligence for everyday tasks. Both of these models seem reasonable too, and Gardner and Sternberg's work has helped teachers appreciate students' variety of talents. But research has suggested that even these different ways to be smart are also linked by some underlying general intelligence factor. So what about other less tangible forms of intelligence like creativity, our ability to produce ideas that are both novel and valuable? How could a test that demands one correct answer account for more creative solutions, so-called divergent thinking? Well, traditional intelligence tests can't, and so far, while we do have some tests that look at creative potential, we don't have a standardized system for quantifying creativity. But Sternberg and his colleagues have identified 5 main components of creativity, which are useful for framing our understanding of what creative intelligence is and how it works. And when you go through the list, you know who I think is really great at almost all of them? Sherlock Holmes. Hear me out. First, we got expertise, or a well-developed base of knowledge. This just means knowing a lot about a lot, whether it's arcane poisons, jellyfish behavior, or how to recognize a secret passage behind a bookshelf. Expertise provides the mind with all sorts of data to work with and combine in new ways. Obviously, Sherlock has incredible imaginative thinking skills too, which provide him with the ability to see things in new ways, recognize patterns, and make connections. He loves nothing more than rehashing these breadcrumb trails for the dopey constables at the end of a case. Sternberg also thought a venturesome personality contributes to creativity. By hanging around opium dens and chasing thugs and generally courting danger, Sherlock routinely seeks new experiences, tolerates risk, and perseveres in overcoming obstacles. And everyone knows he's driven by intrinsic motivation. I mean, he wants to help the widow discover the thief and everything, but really Sherlock is driven by his own interest and sense of challenge. He gets pleasure from the work itself. And finally, Sherlock benefits from a creative environment which sparks, supports, and refines his ideas. For so affectionately maintaining this environment on Sherlock's behalf, we largely have Dr. Watson to thank. Sherlock was obviously an academic and creative genius, but he was pretty weak in another form of intelligence, the emotional kind. Emotional intelligence, defined in 1997 by psychologists Peter Salovey and John Mayer, not that one, is the ability to perceive, understand, manage, and use emotions. I don't know about you, but I know plenty of smart people who have a hard time processing social information. The most brilliant mathematician may struggle to communicate with colleagues and neighbors or staff at the local deli. Likewise, Sherlock often annoys, offends, or even baffles those around him. Perceiving emotions means being able to recognize them in faces and even music and film and stories. Understanding emotions relates to being able to predict them and how they might change, and managing emotions comes down to knowing how to appropriately express yourself in various situations. And finally, emotional intelligence also means using emotions to enable adaptive or creative thinking, like knowing how to manage conflict, or comfort a grieving friend, or work well with others. Much like creative intelligence, emotional intelligence can be measured to some degree through testing, but there's no standardized way to assign a numerical value. So if we can't perfectly quantify things like creativity or emotional smarts, how did we come up with a way to measure intelligence? Well, as I mentioned earlier, it's a sordid story. The first attempts to do it in the Western world began with English scientist Francis Galton in the 1800s. Taking a page from his famous cousin Charles Darwin's theories on natural selection, Galton wondered how that premise might extend to humans' natural ability when it came to intelligence. He suggested that our smarts have a lot to do with heredity, so if we encourage smart people to breed with each other, we could essentially create a master race of geniuses. If that sounds a little sketchy, it's because it was, really sketchy. This study of how to selectively and supposedly improve a human population, especially by encouraging breeding in some people and discouraging it in others, is called eugenics, a term Galton himself coined, and I'll get back to in a minute. But around the turn of the 20th century, when eugenics was taking off, the French government mandated that all children must attend school. Many of these kids had never been in a classroom, and teachers wanted to figure out how they could identify kids who needed extra help. Enter Alfred Binet and Theodore Simon, two French psychologists who were commissioned to develop a test to measure a child's so-called mental age. The concept of a kid's mental age is essentially the level of performance associated with a certain chronological age. So if 6-year-old Bruno tests as well as the average 6-year-old, he'd have a mental age of 6. Binet believed that his tests could measure a child's current mental abilities, but that intelligence wasn't a fixed inborn thing. He believed a person's capabilities could be raised with proper attention, self-discipline, and practice. In other words, he was no eugenicist. He was hoping that his tests would improve children's education by identifying those who needed extra attention. But Binet also feared that these tests would, in the wrong hands, be used to do just the opposite, labeling children as lost causes, limiting their opportunities. And wow, was he onto something, because that is pretty much exactly what happened. German psychologist William Stern used revisions of Binet and Simon's work to create the famous intelligence quotient, or IQ measurement. At the time, your IQ was simply your mental age divided by your chronological age multiplied by 100. So, for example, Bruno is 6, and so is his mental age, so his IQ ranks at 100, but his little sister Betty is a 4-year-old with a mental age of 5, so her IQ would be 125. That formula works pretty well for measuring kids, but it falls apart when it comes to adults who don't hit measurable developmental steps like kids do. I mean, there's no real difference between a mental age of 34 and 35. But Stanford professor Louis Terman started promoting the widespread use of intelligence testing in the early 1900s, and with his help, the US government began the world's first mass administration of intelligence tests when it assessed World War I Army recruits and immigrants fresh off the boat. Unlike Binet, Terman did use these numerical findings as a kind of label, and he thought his tests could, as he put it, ultimately result in curtailing the reproduction of feeble-mindedness. This kind of testing played right into eugenicists' sensibilities, and soon the eugenics movement in the US had a pretty good fan club, raising money from the Carnegies and Rockefeller Rockefellers and with proponents working at Harvard and Columbia and Cornell. In the first half of the 20th century, intelligence tests were used to enforce the sterilization of around 60,000 people, around a third of whom were in California. Most were poor white women, often unwed mothers or prostitutes. Other eugenics efforts persisted further into the century, and there's evidence of poor African American, Native American, or Latina women being forcibly or covertly sterilized in large numbers as recently as the 1970s. But you know who really loved their eugenics? The Nazis. Hitler and his cronies took the idea of intelligence testing to even darker conclusions. The Nazis were all about selecting against so-called feeble-mindedness and other undesirable traits as they sought to strengthen what they saw as their Aryan nation. They sterilized or simply executed hundreds of thousands of victims based on their answers to IQ test questions that were really more about adhering to social norms than measuring actual intelligence. Questions like, who was Bismarck and what does Christmas signify? So you can see how this terrifying history still makes some people leery of how such tests are administered, interpreted, and weighted. Today, we understand that intelligence, as defined by all the people we've talked about here, does appear to be a real and measurable phenomenon. But no one can say that they've disentangled all of the would-be genetic, environmental, educational, and socioeconomic components of it. In the end, it's best to think of intelligence as something about which we've still got a lot to learn, and next week, we'll talk about how we test intelligence today and the problems we still face in doing it. Today, your intelligent mind learned about the history of how we think about and define different types of intelligence, what the G factor is, and how Sherlock Holmes is incredibly intelligent but emotionally unintelligent. You also learned about the history and methods of intelligence testing, IQ scores, and how eugenics turned to the dark side and has since made even talking about intelligence kind of controversial. Thank you for watching, especially to our Subbable subscribers who make Crash Course possible. To find out how you can become a supporter, just go to subbable.com/crashcourse. This episode was written by Kathleen Yale, edited by Blake T. Pastino, and our consultant is Dr. Ranjit Bhagwat. Our director and editor is Nicholas Jenkins, the script supervisor is Michael Aranda, who is also our sound designer, and the graphics team is Thought Cafe.
"7 million people, or 11 per every 1,000 children, have mental retardation or intellectual disabilities. Mental retardation is defined as a condition characterized by significant limitations both in intellectual functioning and in conceptual, social, and practical adaptive skills. Mild retardation is generally said to be people with IQ scores ranging from 55 to 69. This constitutes 90% of people with retardation. They function slower than their peers, but they have jobs, families, can live on their own, etc. Moderate retardation is classified by people with an IQ of 40 to 54. These people can hold simple jobs but need supervision for life. And then finally, there are severely mentally retarded individuals who have an IQ of 25 to 39, and profoundly mentally retarded individuals have an IQ below 25. These people are unable to function independently and need care for life. Biological causes of mental retardation include fetal alcohol syndrome, Down syndrome, complications during birth, head injuries, stroke, meningitis, or abnormalities in the structure of a chromosome. In nearly 1/3 of cases, there is an identifiable biological reason for the mental retardation. Let's go ahead and watch a video on fetal alcohol syndrome, which is the most common cause of mental retardation in newborns, occurring when the mother uses alcohol during pregnancy.
Last week, I got in a fight with someone. He hit me first, so I hit him back.
The fact that I got as far as I have without having a breakdown at any point, a really big one, I got really lucky.
Why are you upset?
Go away! When my birth mother drank when I was in her womb, that it affected parts of my brain and all that.
She said that my mom drank alcohol and it damaged my brain.
Usually had to be physically restrained somewhere along the line as he got older because he'd just tear up everything. We were afraid that he was going to hurt somebody as he got older, but you can't let him see the fear because that just makes him stronger and more determined that he's going to do something.
Do you get into trouble a lot?
Sometimes. They arrest me, take me to jail, 3 days.
I worry about Allison as she gets older on her own. Who's going to be there to tell her right from wrong?
Everything was stacked against this child before she was even born. And the fact that she could scream at 3 o'clock in the morning was a good thing.
I'm sure that something like this can drive a wedge in between a couple, but we have chosen to use this to strengthen us, and it has.
The most common cause of retardation is actually non-biological. It's familial retardation. This is mental retardation in which no apparent biological defect exists, but there is a history of retardation in the family. The intellectually gifted represent 2 to 4% of the population, and they are defined as people who have IQ scores greater than 130. There's a misconception that intellectually gifted people are nerdy or socially awkward, when actually research shows that these people are some of the most outgoing, well-adjusted, healthy, and popular people within a society. In the early 20s, Lewis Terman followed 1,500 kids who had IQs of 140 or higher. Found members of this group were more physically, socially, and academically capable than their peers. They earned higher incomes and received more awards, and they reported a greater satisfaction in life than non-gifted individuals. However, not everyone in the study was successful. So, a high IQ does not guarantee success, but it does seem to make it more likely. Okay, so you'll need to complete lecture activity 3. However, that is it for this chapter. I hope that you have a great remainder of the week, and don't forget to complete all your lecture activities and also get your first forum post done right away. Have a great day.